Hello everyone, today we'll be talking about Romanticism, Realism, and Photography. Europe and America from 1800 to 1870. This is one of my favorites. So we're going to start by talking about Neoclassicism in Napoleonic France. And some of you may have heard of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a French military leader and he later declared himself Emperor of France. He was sort of an egomaniac and he undertook a vast military expansion of France because he wanted to model himself after Alexander the Great. He also commissioned many neoclassical paintings. He aspired to rule an empire that would one day rival ancient Rome, so it makes sense that he would want neoclassical, meaning new classical, classical being ancient Roman and Greek paintings. His famous painter was Jacques-Louis David, and there on the right is a portrait David painted of Napoleon. Here is another portrait of Napoleon by David, and he has Napoleon crossing the St. Bernard Pass, which is in reference to one of his more successful and famous battles. We see a kind of a stateliness and a sense of power that harks back to ancient Rome. Also, many ancient Roman statues of emperors would place the emperors on a horse, so this is in direct reference to that. We have his name carved into the stone below it, just in case you forgot who this was an image of. This is an image that you'll see referenced often now that you know to look for it. And I've included, much smaller as a detail, a picture of one of Kehinde Wiley's paintings. Kehinde Wiley is a contemporary artist who often reimagines these sort of over-the-top neoclassical paintings, but using contemporary figures and changing their meaning. Neoclassicism always references ancient Rome or ancient Greece. I'm including this because it's a relatively interesting painting of Jon Batiste, who was a very interesting philosopher of this time period, and he's painted here aligning himself with the thinkers of ancient Greece and Rome. A very direct reference to ancient Greece and Rome, we have the apotheosis, so the crowning and creating of a god is what apotheosis means, of Homer, who was the blind poet that is credited with having authored the Iliad and Odyssey. And we see an inclusion of also kind of contemporary thinkers in this apotheosis, not only Greek gods, but thinkers of France. So it's a combination of the ideas of ancient Greece and Rome with a glorification of the culture of which Angers is part of, which is French culture. But we see in this time period too a shift. So these artworks that we were looking at are very obviously neoclassical. But we'll see a shift towards art that edges away from the neoclassical. For example, does this look like the images that we've seen before? Would you consider this neoclassicism? I would argue not, even though it's painted by Angers, who is also the painter of the previous painting that we were just looking at. Why isn't it neoclassical? Well, because everything about it makes you rather uncomfortable. Let's start with the title, Grande Odalisque. An odalisque is a sex slave. And this woman is sitting in a sort of fake Turkish interior. It's supposed to make you think of the Near East, but she's white, so we have to assume that she's somebody's sex slave. Look at her proportions. Her back is elongated. Nobody's spine is actually that long. This leg here appears to be protruding from around here. It doesn't seem to be connected to her hip. The extreme darkness makes her one eye disappear, so everything about this seems rather strange, uncomfortable, maybe even a little bit ominous. All of these are aspects of Romanticism, which is an important movement of this time period. Some of the features of Romanticism are the interest in the exotic, erotic, the landscape, and in fictional narrative as subject matter. This is an art movement against neoclassicism, and against the technological revolution. I've come up with a little acronym, PINE, and PINE stands for Past, Irrational Inner Mind, Insanity, Nature, and Emotion or the Exotic. All of these things classify Romanticism. So if you see paintings that take one or any of these as their subject matter from this time period, you can probably pretty safely assume that they're an example of Romantic artwork. Here's a classic example. This is The Nightmare by Fuseli. So you'll see that it takes the idea of irrationality or the inner mind or insanity as its subject matter. This is a woman who's having a nightmare, and she has a small demon crouching on her chest. The horse isn't a reference to nightmare. It's not a play on words as we would assume. It's rather maybe what the demon came riding in on. And it's kind of has a sensual undertone to the way that the female figure is painted. The subconscious is often taken as a prominent theme in Romantic artwork. This is a very famous etching by Goya. It's called, and you might be able to just faintly read the words here in Spanish, "The sleep of reason produces monsters," and it's the beginning etching of a series of etchings called Los Caprichos that Goya undertook. All of them take as their subject matter the unconscious or the irrational mind in day-to-day life, but also in society as a whole. Goya was a court painter, but he was also very prolific and produced a number of paintings that were political or very personal in nature. This is the 3rd of May. It's a painting he produced as a commentary on the Napoleonic invasion of Spain. We can see this central figure of a peasant who's being shot, and although he's not anybody famous, he's being illuminated by a light that seems to be coming from nowhere, if not as a divine light, and the way that he's holding out his arms makes us think of Christ. So although this takes a political subject, it's the very specific and emotional way that it's painted aligns it with Romanticism. My favorite artistic output of Goya are his black paintings, and I'm including here an image of Saturn devouring one of his children. Goya painted the black paintings on the walls of his house, and he painted them towards the end of his life when he was deaf and he was beginning to go blind. Nobody really knows what they mean, but they're very, very emotional, very vividly painted, and very contemporary in the way that they portray violence, pain, suffering, and the subconscious desires of the human mind. Moving on to France, I'm going to show you some images by Jericho. Jericho is a French painter who is very interested in human psychology. He undertook a series of paintings. They are portraits of people in an insane asylum, and here is a portrait he did of an insane woman who was experiencing anxiety. His idea was that perhaps by painting these portraits of people, he would come to better understand their psychological state by portraying their physical state. Here is his painting, The Raft of the Medusa. The Raft of the Medusa portrays an actual historical event in which a crew was shipwrecked, and they floated on the sea for a very long time before they were finally saved. This is a classic example of Romantic painting because of the way that human emotion and pain and suffering are foregrounded. It's painted in a very emotional way. It's also kind of moving away from some of the traditional tropes of the Academy, since the person that's portrayed as the hero of this painting and is also at the pinnacle of the painting itself is a black man, and all of the other people are white. This was a subject of much criticism during the time. It is said that Jericho would set his leg on fire with a candle, so he would have a candle burning and place it below his leg, and then really look at his face while his flesh was being burned so that he could more accurately portray pain in his painting. Eugene Delacroix was of the same school. This is one of his most famous images of liberty leading the people. And in France, this image is held up as a wonderful example of the idea of liberty as it is expressed in France. I think it's kind of interesting that the central figure of this, the figure of liberty herself, is a woman whose shirt has fallen off. The idea of a bare-breasted woman representing a nation's idea of liberty is very different than the way that we often portray liberty in the U.S. I am including a picture of the Statue of Liberty on the left. Even though that was sculpted by a French sculptor, he seemed to know that the American sensibility would prefer our vision of liberty to be very fully clothed. This painting is a very good example of French Romanticism, again, because of the sort of excessive drama, the inclusion of rather irrational elements, like the topless figure of liberty, and the vividness and emotionality with which the figures are painted. I mentioned that nature is often painted by Romantic painters, as are landscapes, so I'm including some images by Friedrich. And here is a quote that Friedrich is credited with. "Why, it has often occurred to me to ask myself, do I so frequently choose death, transience, and the grave as subjects for my paintings? One must submit oneself many times to death in order some day to attain life everlasting." And Friedrich believed that through portraying very dramatic and very intense natural landscapes, he might encourage viewers to consider death, and through the consideration of death, to appreciate life more fully. William Turner also is famous for painting romantic landscapes. In this one here, at first glance, it appears to just be a very dramatic sunset. But when you look slightly more closely, you'll see, and then, of course, the title also tips you in, that it's an image of a slave ship with slavers throwing overboard dead and dying slaves, and with a typhoon coming on. So, although it visually appears to be a kind of soothing image, the subject matter is quite romantic in nature and encourages the viewer to contemplate suffering and death. There is a very large and well-respected school of Romantic landscape painters from the Americas. Albert Bierstadt is one of the most respected of them. Here's an image of the Sierra Nevada mountains, and this canvas is exceptionally large. It's 6 feet by 10 feet. So when you see it, you feel absolutely engulfed with this sense of wonder, but also overwhelming majesty. A majesty that's so powerful that it might make you stop and consider death, which is, again, a hallmark of Romantic painting. Romanticism as a movement also manifested itself in architecture, but in architecture we see a revival of Gothic architecture. The Brooklyn Bridge is an excellent example. The architects that designed it were very inspired by Gothic churches and used the arches and the kind of tall architecture of Gothic cathedrals when creating the Brooklyn Bridge. So it seems to be kind of out of time and out of place and is incredibly distinctive. Let's talk a little bit about modernism versus realism. Modernism and realism were two conflicting movements of this time period. So realists painted people and events of their own time, and they disapproved of historical and fictional subjects. They painted real life. Now, modernists are more interested in the nature of art itself. So modernist art goes beyond painting the visible world and involved the artist's critical examination of the nature of art itself. We'll see modernism being explored by artists also following this time period, so this is just the beginning of modernism. But first, let's look at some realist paintings. Keep in mind that while all of this was happening, there was the artwork of the French academic Salon that had no involvement with either realism or modernism, but instead the people of the French academic Salon were all trained in the same style, and they all painted images like this one here that had no relation to paintings about the nature of art itself or about real everyday life. They were instead just very highly well rendered paintings that were made to appeal to the high classes, and therefore artists that were self-taught or that were more interested in politics or philosophy really hated artwork like this because they argued that it was just a commodity. It was just a thing that people were making so that rich people could buy it. So realism. Here's some realism. You can see just how different it is than the image we were just looking at. It's an image of stone breakers, and stone breakers were among the poorest class of people in France, and they lived and died by breaking stones. And you can see in this image here, both people are turned away. It's not really about their identities. They're just frozen in this act of forever breaking stones. They're trapped by their social class. It's about the harsh reality of everyday life. Here by Courbet as well is the burial at Ornans, and it's just a burial, a common everyday burial. That's it. That's the subject. But look at how large it is. It's 22 feet long. When critics first saw this, they were appalled by this painting because they said it was a painting of nothing, just of regular everyday people, that it was offensive to see a painting of nothing that was so incredibly monumentally large. And they also were offended by the fact that the grave is placed in the center. So when you're standing in front of the painting, you sort of feel like you're being buried alive, or like the painting itself is engulfing you in the grave. All of this is meant to try and raise the idea of reality and the experience of everyday reality to the height of monumental painting, and to truly involve the viewer in this sense of monumentality. Rosa Bonheur. Again, there are relatively few female painters that reached any level of success in this time period, but Rosa Bonheur was one of those. This is her monumental painting of the horse fair, and the horse fair would have been a common event that would have been run mostly by people who identified as gypsies, and they would have sold horses. So it's a very low-class common event, but here she's raised it to a monumental level by painting the horses with incredible beauty and life, and painting it on such a large scale. Now moving forward to modernism. As I mentioned before, modernist art is art that is about art, the nature of art itself. So here, this is Luncheon on the Grass, but quite a few details about it should immediately tip you off to the fact that this isn't really about a picnic. First, the female figure is naked, and I know of very few picnics where some people remain naked and some people remain clothed. So obviously this isn't about a real event. This is more about an artwork. And if you look at in the background too, this figure here is abnormally large. Imagine if she stood up and walked forward, she would be a giant compared to everybody else. Also, the background feels as though it's many different backgrounds collaged together. There is no sense of unity in this. This is an artwork that's about the fact that it is a fake. It's not trying to create the illusion of anything real. Instead, it's about the nature of illusion itself. Manet was very interested in using paintings such as the Luncheon on the Grass and such as Olympia to force people to really try and investigate the nature of the image. So he would always include elements that made the viewer uncomfortable. In the previous image, it was his use of nudity and also the use of perspective or misuse of perspective that was designed to make the viewer question the nature of the image. In this one here, it's the title and the way that the figure is portrayed. Olympia is a name that makes one think perhaps of the Greek gods and Mount Olympus, but Olympia was also a very popular name for prostitutes at this time period. The way that he's portrayed this nude female figure makes her seem more naked than nude because of the way that she presses down her hand over her pubic area and makes unashamed eye contact with the viewer. One feels as though they're not looking at a mythological subject, but as though they've walked into the room of a prostitute and they're unwanted. The flowers that the woman, who we have to assume is her servant, is bringing her are probably from a male caller, and the black cat on the edge of the bed is supposed to represent folly or sin. So instead of the images that we've seen up to this point of nude female figures, which either represent a religious subject or a mythological subject, this here seems as though it were a portrait of somebody that's very real, and critics were outraged that an artist would choose to portray such low-class subjects in what's viewed as such a precious medium, the medium of painting. Let's look at some photography. Photography as a form emerged in 1839, and many people came up with early versions of photography around the same time, but some of the earliest are the daguerreotype. The daguerreotype was created by Louis-Jacques Monde Daguerre in Paris, and it's a method of creating a photograph onto a copper plate. William Henry Fox Talbot created the calotype, which is an early method of printing photographs from paper, and all photographic forms have evolved from these two early types of photography. This is one of the earliest photographic images. It's an image of a still life in a studio. Many of these early images had incredibly long exposure times, so it would have been minutes and minutes to create an image like this. The earliest photograph was actually created over a matter of hours, so lots of early photographs are of still lifes, and then later, as the technique is sped up a little bit, it's always of people who are sitting very, very still when it is of people at all. Sitting very still, or perhaps even dead, as is the case of this image. This is an image by Timothy O'Sullivan. He and Alex Gardner and a number of other photographers undertook Civil War photography, and their images are incredibly powerful and are still very famous till this day. Many of them were published in newspapers, and people would flock to buy the newspapers to look at the dead to try to see if they recognized any of the bodies. This is an early example of photography being used to document real-life events. Imagine a time before photography when people would know that there was a war happening, but they would never be able to see images of it, and therefore the brutality of it wouldn't sink in unless they were actually involved in the battle. Photography is a good way for people who aren't at a place to be able to imagine what exactly is happening somewhere else. Photography can also be used to photograph things that we can't see with the naked eye, such as the exact movement of a horse galloping. Before Edward Muybridge came up with his system of photographing animals and humans in motion, nobody knew exactly what movements were undertaken by animals that were moving very fast. And so you'll see in paintings up from this time period, many of the horses who were running just looked like rocking horses with their limbs outspread. But following Muybridge, artists were able to use photographic reference such as this to accurately portray a body in motion. And that concludes today's lecture.